What up YouTube, this is John Helm with Helm, Woodshop, and Smithy back with another knife making video. So in my last video, I told you that I had a big project planned, and I do, and I'm super stoked about it. I'm gonna make an almost sword length Confederate D-guard Bowie knife. I'm gonna have a two-piece, big, curly, cool looking guard on it. I'm planning on doing a peened over tang. I'm gonna have stabilized wood scales that I stack and glue together. And then I'm still debating on what I'm gonna make the blade out of. So let's go take a look at what I have available. I have here a bar of 01 tool steel. I believe this is 4340 and this is 4140. 43 and 4340 at 0.4% carbon content aren't generally what people would use for knives. It's a little bit on the low side. While it is still hardenable, it's not gonna hold an edge like 01 tool steel or 1080, any of the higher carbon steels. But I have made a ton of edge tools, especially ones that absorb a lot of impact, like axes out of 4340 and 4140, and they actually retain their edge quite well. And I want this to be sort of a heavy, choppy kind of knife. And so I think that going with one of these may not be a terrible idea. However, if I want it to be delicate and have a good distal taper on it, I'm gonna need to use the 01 tool steel. So I'm really kind of torn. I'm not to that point yet, so if you have any input, please drop it in the comments. The reason I'm not to that point yet is because I stabilize wood at home in a jar full of lacquer, and so I need to go ahead and get the handle put together because it's gonna take at least a week for this wood to suck up enough lacquer for it to really be stabilized. So that's what we're gonna be doing today. So some of you are probably wondering, what is wood stabilization and why do we need to do it on our knife handles? Well, a regular piece of wood has grain in it, and it has little holes in that grain that are literally made for sucking up water. And sucking up water is the last thing that we want our knife handle to do, because if you allow moisture into the wood, it's gonna make the wood get bigger or smaller, and as it expands and or contracts, it can work its way away from a glue joint. It can leave gaps in between your tang and the scale. It can leave gaps around your pin. All these are bad and we don't want them to happen. Also, unstabilized handles are really hard to clean once they get dirty. Unless you have a thick layer of sealant on the outside, that dirt just gets down in the grain, and really the only way to make it look good again is to sand it down and reseal it. But by impregnating the wood with something to fill those voids that is completely waterproof, we can minimize or completely avoid that. Now, the way that I'm doing it today is not the best way to do it, but it's the way that I do it, and it does in fact work. It just takes some extra elbow grease. It takes a little extra time, but it takes much less expensive equipment. So here's the Bowie knife that I sketched out. It is super sexy, it has curves in all the right places, and it also has this super cool stacked handle, which will be made out of 3 different materials, but what those materials are, I haven't decided yet. These dark slips here, these could be anything from mild steel to brass to walnut. This piece in the middle could be mahogany, red oak. These pieces at the end could be mahogany, red oak, anything that's light. Basically what I want is the color contrast. I want a light color, a dark color, a medium color, a dark color, and a light color. So let's head over to the wood bin and see what I have laying around. All right, we have a beautiful piece of mahogany here. That is always a candidate. We have some walnut. There's a piece of red oak. Oh, this is European beechwood, and it is quite a beautiful piece of it. We have various mystery hardwoods. Well, that's it in this one. I decided to go with mahogany for the middle of the handle, black walnut for the spacers in the handle, and red oak for the top and bottom of the handle. I think that this gives a good color contrast, and they're all 3 very tough, strong woods, so this should be good for making a handle. The faces are all flat. Push them up together. I don't see any gaps in between them. Everything sits nice and flush. So we're ready to glue up. So I gave these about half an hour to dry. Of course, they won't be completely cured for, I don't know, 24 hours or something, but they're at least dry enough for us to start cutting the wood down. Now, we have to cut the wood down before we stabilize for two reasons. Reason number one is that these are really big and the vessel I need to put them in is too small to accommodate them. Reason number two is that I'm using an at-home, ghetto, easy way to stabilize your wood. I don't have a nice vacuum chamber or a pressure pot or any of the other things that other people use. I'm literally just going to be jarring these like they were pickles in a pickle jar. That creates a vacuum and it helps you suck up the lacquer. In the past, I did an experiment where I took various thicknesses and species of wood and I stabilized them using this method in a jar of lacquer that had been dyed black with India ink. And then once they were dry, I cut them open and I could see how deep the lacquer penetrated the wood. What you can expect is about 1/4 of an inch of penetration on either side, which means that this needs to be no thicker than 1/2 of an inch. And also, I'm going to cut it down closer to the dimensions of the final handle in this plane, and that's really just to make it easier to get in and out of the jar. Now, if you've done any amount of woodworking, you probably already know that in woodworking, reference surfaces are paramount. They are everything. If you have good reference surfaces, you have good cuts, period. Now this does not have a good reference surface. It's all bumpy and uneven because I just glued it up and you can't keep it perfectly flush during the glue up. So before I can take this and put it on the table saw or on the miter saw, I need to get one of these edges perfectly flat so that it can reference up against the fence and we can get a good cut on the opposite side. It can be really difficult to plane a really bumpy, uneven piece of wood flat, especially if you have a cheap or poorly set up hand plane, which most blacksmiths probably don't have a nice and well set up hand plane. So there are other ways that you can do it. The easiest way is if you have a cheapy little hand plane, like this piece of crap Stanley that I hate, you can just find your high spots. You can just take a rasp and file those down until it's mostly smooth. You could also do this with a nice sharp chisel. Of course, if you don't have a nice sharp plane, you probably don't have good chisels either. All right, now we have, it's not flat, but it's at least somewhat smooth. And now it'll be a lot easier to go over with your hand plane. This thing is damn near impossible to get set up right. There we go. That's all she wrote. Definitely won't be doing that on the other side though. I have a nice plane, so I'm going to utilize it. And now, with two edges that are nice and flat adjacent to one another, it'll be easy and safe to put it through the table saw. I need to be sure when I cut these to length that the different types of wood line up on the two pieces because they are going to be getting glued together. So I'm going to cut them together and rather than separately just to make sure that everything is nice and even. And this is everything that we need to actually stabilize our wood. I like to use this cast iron pot because I'm going to be putting it on fire outside, and obviously I don't care if it gets smoke stained because it's already black. You could use a regular pot. It'll smoke stain the sides, which is a pain to get off. You can get off with 409 and Barkeeper's Friend if you want. Or if you have a turkey fryer, that would be an ideal way of doing this. But you just definitely don't want to do it inside. We're going to be heating up lacquer the lacquer thinner in that lacquer is going to be rapidly evaporating. You don't want to breathe it in. So even though we're outside, I'm still going to be wearing a ventilator. We're just going to open up our pot, put a rag in the bottom of it. You don't want the glass in contact with the metal, because once the water starts boiling in here, it'll bounce around, and I've had them crack on me in the past. That is a mess. Stick that in there. We're going to fill this up with water. Open up the cap. Well, that's easier said than done. I'll be back. All right, I got that open. Go ahead and make your jokes about the big blacksmith guy who can't even open up a jar. Place your wood inside. Man, that is the perfect size for this. You want your lacquer to go right up to the top with just a tiny little gap. We're gonna put our lid on, but don't do it tightly at first. Leave it on a little bit loose. We want the air inside of here to be able to get out when this heats up and the lacquer expands. So once it's expanded, we will shut this, take it off the heat, and as it cools, it'll form a vacuum. You can see in the lid when it gets sucked down that there's now a vacuum inside, and that helps the lacquer penetrate into the pores of the wood. So now I'm gonna light the forge, stick our pot on it, and we're gonna jar these pieces of wood just like they were pickles. I'll let the forge run for a little bit until it's just about hot enough to boil. Then I'll take the pot off, add a little bit more coal, turn off the blower, and set it there, let it get nice and hot all the way through the jar. It is especially important that you make sure that you don't spill any of this lacquer into the fire, because it is very flammable. It will go up just like gasoline, especially with those super high temperatures in the bottom of a forge. So this can be a little bit dangerous. It doesn't have to be though if you have a pot with a big enough circumference so that any lacquer that spills will fall into the water. You're probably good, but definitely make sure you have a fire extinguisher handy and you're not doing this next to the house or next to anything that's flammable, like doing it on top of your wooden deck would obviously be a bad idea. Just don't be stupid, be mindful of the dangers inherent in doing activities like this. That should be good. Went ahead and turned the blower on towards the end to make sure that it was really hot so we could get a good vacuum on here. The jar is obviously going to be very hot, so wear some welding gloves while you tighten it up. Get it on nice and tight, and then we'll set it aside and let it get a seal as it cools. Now, when you let it cool, it's a good idea to set it down upside down. The reason being, it's harder for air to get in the jar as it cools in case you don't have a perfect seal. And it's very possible that I don't, because this jar lid has a bunch of dried lacquer on the inside of it, which can make it hard to have enough contact area around the rim. But doing it this way really helps. Now that I have this all made, I can go ahead and forge out my blade, grind it, make the guard, and by the time I'm done with all that, these handle scales will be ready to rock. Keep in mind, you don't have to heat it up and jar it the way that I did here. You can just take your scales, throw them in a bucket of sealant, wait a month or two, take them out, let them dry, and hey, you got some stabilized wood. But that takes a long time. This is much faster. Also, you should keep in mind the type of sealant that you use. You don't have to use lacquer like I use today. You could use spar urethane, you could use oil-based polyurethane. Those will work fine, although they will impart that amber color onto the wood that they're known for. Sometimes this is good, but with this handle having the light wood on it, I definitely want to highlight that brightness, so I'm using lacquer for that reason. One thing you really need to be sure to avoid is using water-based sealants. They don't cure, they dry. So the water evaporates out of it, and that's how it gets hard. That means that A, you're gonna be waiting for it to dry forever, unless you live somewhere where it is super hot, and even then, the outside will dry real fast and it'll store that moisture inside once it's sealed on the outside. So it can take a really long time. Also, since it evaporates the water off, it loses a lot of volume as it dries. Oil-based sealants don't lose nearly the amount of volume, which means that you don't have as much voids in the grain, which means that you have a better stabilization. So just be sure to keep that in mind when you're deciding which sealant to use. And remember, I'm debating between 3 types of metal for the blade, and I'd like your input. So if you have any ideas on why I should or shouldn't use 4140, 4340, or 01 tool steel, drop those in the comments below. As always, like and subscribe. Thank you for joining me.